further ado, we are moving into a new phase in our class where we have a new book to enjoy. We Should Never Meet by Amy Fan. It invites us to look at some other more very specific issues related to globalization, the topic we're looking at all term long. I would say that the book allows us to take an even closer look at all the issues that Malala's story kind of raised for us, namely the challenges and opportunities that arise when people find themselves between cultures, between nationalities, out of place in a new culture, torn from an old one sometimes due to paroxysms of war. Our speaker, Dr. Mark Jerng, he has a PhD from Harvard and an MA from Princeton, and he's written a whole critical study that discusses what looks like we should never meet, especially in relation to transnational adoption, which I think he's going to talk to us about today. And the book is called Claiming Others, Transracial Adoption and National Belonging. We are so incredibly lucky to have him travel to us today from Davis, where he is a professor at the UT. He's currently working, this really interests me, and I hope you bring questions about this to your roundtable. Apparently currently working on a book called Racial World Making, which looks at fantasy, futurist, and other popular literary genres, and to look at how those genres help us and hinder us from perceiving issues of race in the world. So bring your energy to the roundtable today. I'm going to bring mine. He teaches lots of courses in global literatures and critical approaches to the intersections, especially of race and literature. Professor Mark Jerng, let's give him a huge round.
Is this working okay? Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that introduction, Scott. Thank you to both Don and Scott for inviting me, organizing this session. Great book and provocative theme. Before I start, are you guys all enjoying the book so far? Yeah? Any first impressions? Any just kind of initial thoughts? Anyone at all? Anything that stuck out to you in reading? It's sad. It is sad, yeah. Really, really sad, yeah. It is very, very sad. Any other first impressions? It's got a lot of violence. So kind of beginning kind of violence there. Yeah. Anything else? Have people read collections of short stories before like this? Okay. We'll be talking a little bit about the form of that and how they kind of relate to each other. So, as Dr. Miller mentioned in the introduction, my engagement with We Should Never Meet came out of a book that I wrote detailing a cultural history of adoption stories. Writers in the US have been telling transracial, transnational adoption stories for a long time, actually, adopting a child from a different race and or nationality than one's own. As I traced it in my book as early as the 1820s, with adoption between white settlers and Native Americans. And so one of the things that I've been most interested in is how these stories address this process of being transported into a different country or a different family. Because that change has been shaped in particular ways. It's been shaped by legal norms. It's been shaped by institutions. Our really main institutions for adoption didn't get going until the early 20th century, but adoption had been going on for 70, 80 years before that. But most importantly for my purposes, they've been shaped by the stories we tell, by the narratives that we write. And I think We Should Never Meet is most interesting in terms of how it participates in this question about how to narrate the stories of transnational adoptees and the ways that they're being recognized as subjects. So with that in mind, I want to do two things for you today. First, I want to place We Should Never Meet within the context of a larger set of stories about transnational adoption. So I'll start by showing you a clip from a documentary called Daughter from Da Nang. And I'm doing that in order not so much to kind of counterpose history against fiction, but more importantly to highlight some of the ways of telling a story that attend the experience and histories of transnational adoption, the Vietnam War, and Operation Baby Lift. So I hope I can make clear the central question here. Why might some of our usual habits for telling a life story not work for the life stories of transnational adoptees? And what do the attempts to tell this story differently show us about this relationship between identity and history today. The second thing that I want to do is give you a sense of a couple of Amy Phan's main kind of interventions into this question. And I want to detail 3 of them. I might only have time for 2 of them. We'll see how I'm doing on time. The form of the short story collection as a whole, the idea of not meeting that is embedded in its title, and if we have time, the use of free indirect discourse. Okay, so first, Daughter from Dong. Anyone familiar with this movie at all? No? Daughter from Dong tells the story of Heidi, a woman who was adopted from Vietnam and raised in Nashville, Tennessee. She was adopted through Operation Baby Lift, which was a US government initiative to airlift babies, babies who are presumed to be orphans, but as we know from this documentary and lots of other histories, they weren't always orphans. Their parents were often alive and well, who were perhaps sometimes coerced into giving up their babies, sometimes convinced into giving up their babies. And the documentary centers on Heidi's journey back to Vietnam in order to meet her biological parents whom she thought presumed to be dead. Daughter from Jeong is, so it gets sadder, it gets sadder and sadder the further we go. Daughter from Jeong is like many adoption stories being told in the news that center on reunions, the act of meeting your biological parents, and the idea is that, oh, you come to find out who you really are, you find out your biological heritage. That was the most privileged way of telling these stories. The term for this is the search and reunion narrative. And this becomes a kind of life story that I think is familiar to us because it mirrors other kinds of stories we tell, right? The search for wholeness, the search for identity. But the reason why I want to show you this beginning is because, like other documentaries, it doesn't just give you the reunion story. It has to layer that story in relationship to the history of military conflict, a history of war that the nation has often wanted to forget. Let me play you the first just couple minutes of this documentary, if I can get this right. Blow it up for you. There we go. Thank you.
Ở ngoài nó đánh vô, Trăng nó đánh ra, họ đòn quá chừng tôi sợ. Không đưa thì con nó chết, mình chết thôi.
And I remember this for as long as I lived. It was just so vivid. We were standing there, we were holding hands. They literally had to pry us apart to get me on that plane. How could she do this to me? How could you just give up a child like that?
Hơn 10 mấy năm nay thương quá, đứt từng đoạn ruột mà trời gặp con thì ở đâu đem đến cho tôi chứ coi như tôi sinh lần thứ hai nữa đó. Một cây kim ở dưới biển mà đi mò được.
I've always wanted to know about my birth.
Just want to show the very beginning of that. And it goes on to produce this very sentimental kind of reunion story between Heidi and her mom. But like We Should Never Meet, it starts with the birth mother. It starts with the birth mother who relinquished a child. And this was actually quite rare. When Amy Fan published this in 2004, a lot of the attention was still being given primarily to adoptive parents and their adopted children, and then gradually more and more attention started getting paid to birth parents, their experiences as part of this kind of important history. So not surprisingly, narratives of transnational adoption often will reinsert individual stories into these kind of larger national histories. So many of the most influential documentaries double as almost like meta-histories. They tell the history of the Korean War or the Vietnam War through a particular lens. But this is a tricky proposition for two reasons. One, the histories out of which the lives of transnational adoptees emerge are being actively repressed. Right? People actually don't really want to remember that much about the Vietnam War in particular. From the way in which the Korean War gets talked about, it's often talked about as the forgotten war. Right? So you're talking about lives that are trying to emerge into representation against the backdrop of histories that people are trying to kind of actively forget. The second reason why this is difficult is that the process of adoption itself is premised on an erasure. So erasing the fact of birth parents, using adoption papers and statements of relinquishments in order to erase any other national identity besides that of being American. Many of the children adopted were raised thinking that their parents were dead. Thinking that even though many times that was not true. It was actually a legal system, a legal norm. It's called the clean break model. They decided in the 50s and 60s to create a kind of clean break model that said that the child needs to be fully integrated into the adoptive family, and all ties to the biological family must be severed. So we're talking about the identities of people who are premised on a kind of necessary erasure, right? A necessary erasure of historical connections and other narratives of belonging in order to produce who they are. In other words, there's no easy way for these lives to count because we have our own kind of normative assumptions concerning birth culture, right? Think of the simple statement, I was born in New Jersey on March 6, 1976, or I was born in Santa Rosa, California on January 5th, 1990. When we even say that statement, we're holding on to a normative notion of identity, specifically that I'm the subject of a history that is my own and no one else's. I am born with a past. But what stories of transnational adoption suggest is that there's no simple way to access that narrative, and the capacity to make their stories historical is more complicated than that. By telling the story of transnational adoption differently, these stories, and I'll give you a couple other examples besides We Should Never Meet here, these stories begin to challenge the erasures that are done in the service of producing a continuity between history and identity. We can't make an easy link between birth and kind of one national identity anymore. So let me quickly reference two other examples where we see this happening. One, another documentary that I would very much recommend, done by Lien. She is writing out of relationship to the Korean War. She's done several, actually. First Person Plural was her first one. Second one was called In the Matter of Cha Jang-hee. She was actually, the drama of these documentaries is that she was actually switched with another baby in order to be adopted. So all of her passport information, all of her legal information was actually somebody else. And so she was switched with somebody else. And then through these narratives, she both goes back to find her biological parents, but then also to find who that somebody else was. So just a line that I find very, very useful. Beginning of this documentary, first person plural, she says, I've had 3 names, 3 different set of histories. Sorry, 3 different sets of histories. Thinking about that way in which these stories work outside of any kind of singular relationship to historical events. The second one that I'll just mention for you here is a memoir called Jeong, Trenka's The Language of Blood, another very, very good story if you're interested. Here, we have it played out a little bit more. She does not begin the novel, the memoir with this. This occurs maybe 6 pages in. But she kind of plays out her 2 different genealogies here. One speaking to her birth in Korea. Second, speaking to the adoption. Look at the language that she's using here, right? Created September 26, 1972. She makes sure to note that the date of her birth is a lunar date, January 24th, 1972, referencing the very different set of cultural norms, even around the calendar year, that we have to rethink when we put these 2 together. I want to emphasize that I'm not here mentioning a kind of question of divided identity. I don't want to say like she's, kind of conflicted between being Korean and being American. What I want to emphasize here is that she's juxtaposing these different social conditions by which her life could be made legible, right? By which her life can be made recognizable. We use these things all the time, right? My name is this, I was born on such and such a date, I was born in such and such a place. Those are all norms that we use in order to constitute who we are. Amy Phan's work is different than these other examples. It's not a first-person account, as you have noticed. Phan is not an adoptee herself, working to challenge these frameworks as they have been imposed on her own personal identity. What it does, though, is give us a different way of talking about this relationship between history and identity. If the story of the adoptee, and I've done the literary history on this up until roughly the 1990s, centered primarily on the adoptee and the adoptive family, Phan gives us a whole other set of actors, as you've probably already noticed. I think you're up to around the 4th story or so. She gives us, social workers, charity organizations, military personnel, foster care parents, other immigrants, other Vietnamese Americans. All of these she is bringing into play in order to show this larger landscape of the lives that revolve around and are affected by transnational adoption. And this involves different circuits of social reproduction, different ways of reproducing identities. The orphan here is not just an orphan because of tragedy or accident. The orphan is produced by specific political conditions. The birth mother is not just presumed dead. She's denied or erased because social conditions require her to be erased. Military personnel, they're not just the kind of harsh facts of existence. They play very clear, very specific roles in producing how and when children will be orphaned, taken up, and adopted. So I want to give you 3 ways of thinking about We Should Never Meet in order to highlight the work that it is doing. And I want to center this around these questions that I've tried to prepare you for. First, how does Phan give us a different way of thinking about the relationship between the social and political conditions of transnational adoption and the telling of a life story? How does she challenge these kinds of normative constraints on what counts as a life? And these are the 3 aspects that I want to focus on. The structure of the collection, this theme of never meeting, and again, if I have time, and I hope Scott might just give me a little heads up if I'm running too far, free and direct discourse. Okay, so the first is the form of the collection as a whole. Operation Baby Lift, which you'll be hopefully going on that field trip, which is great. I was actually brought in to advise on that exhibit. Tell me what you think. Operation Baby Lift is at the center of this collection of short stories, but as I already referenced before, the collection distributes its attention to not just adoptees, adoptive parents and birth mothers, but also social workers, Christian charity workers, foster children who were never adopted into a kind of stable, relatively long-lasting home. So she still deals with parts of the adoptee story through that search and reunion, but they become embedded within a wider set of actors. So part of what she is doing to the adoption story is to break it up. Right? She breaks it up and sees a whole set of relationships, larger social, historical relationships. And as you can probably tell already from the first story, she centers her narrative on other parts that had not been really given that much attention before, namely the biological mother who gives up the baby and who lives in circumstances that force her to give them up. Second observation that I want to make about the structure of this collection is that it moves back and forth between Vietnam and the US. It focuses closely on characters who are sometimes workers at an orphanage in Vietnam, and then on foster kids in the United States. So we're constantly kind of spatially moving back and forth between Vietnam and the US, almost inviting us to think about what are some of the multiple connections that are being created here. And the last observation that I want to make about the structure of this short story collection is that, and you'll notice this more as you get further along, but something for you to look out for as you continue reading. It picks up the same characters, but in different stories, and often at different points in their lives. So for example, in a story that you've probably read by now, the title story, We Should Never Meet, it concentrates on the character Kim and her relationships with Vin and a store owner. And Mai in that story is just a kind of minor character. But later on in Emancipation, Mai is one of the major characters of that story. So it picks up the threads of these characters. I think in 4 stories in, the only place where this has really happened was with the Vin. Vin gets picked up, right, in 2 different places. But notice that we're not just like given the life story of a character like Vin. We don't see what his life story is from beginning to end. We're given a bit of his story here, a bit of his story there. They're fragments. We're not given clear connections between them. In all of these aspects having to do with the structure, Fan is asking us, its readers, to form connections and relationships. What is the relationship between conditions on the ground in Vietnam and conditions on the ground in specific US neighborhoods? Is Miss Lien, who we meet in the very first story, is she the birth mother of one of the orphans who we meet later on? We never quite know. Fan even makes sure to disrupt some of those connections that we might want to make. So in the story Bound, she tells the story of a nurse named Bridget who works in Vietnam and is planning to adopt a boy named Juan. The next story tells the story of Juan, and he's going back to Vietnam with his adoptive mother. But his adoptive mother is named Gwen, not Bridget. And so we read this story, and we're like, oh, well, the next story, this is just going to be a pure connection with the next one. But it's not. She gives us these kinds of missed connections. So what's going on here? Is Fan she's just trying to frustrate us? She's just trying to, plant these seeds just to make us go down these false roads? I think she wants to frustrate our desire to see simple continuities. She doesn't want to give us any kind of one-to-one correspondences between history and character, and instead invites us to speculate on how these pieces might fit together. Something to look out for as you go through the rest of this collection. That I see it as a very much a kind of large theme of this book, being part of the same history and all these connections through Operation Baby Lift, but being irrevocably separated from each other at the same time. It's one of the reasons why it's so sad. Why you've got this pervasive kind of sadness, because it's working through these losses and these gaps. Okay. this leads me to the second focus that I want to offer you today. The title, We Should Never Meet, is also a theme and a kind of narrative device in the collection as a whole. So as I've just described the collection, it's a collection that's full of gaps. We fill them at our own peril, since making a continuous history can often be done in the service of forgetting the past. In those examples that I gave you earlier from Trenka and Lien, they're trying to work within the problem of multiple histories, right? Multiple birth dates. They're not trying to get rid of it in the hopes of creating some singular identity. So the way I read that title is showing us the dangers of creating fictional notions of continuity without acknowledging these gaps. Let me give you two examples of this interpretive work that these gaps are doing. The first is in the first story itself. If you map out what this story is doing in terms of its plot, we've got two different plot strands, right? The first plot strand is, and I've mapped them out here as the first narrative movement and the second narrative movement. The first plot strand is Miss Lien having the baby and then relinquishing the baby. The second one follows her from her childhood, leading right up until when she is raped. And these are two narrative threads that never quite meet, right? We're given these parallel kinds of things. The second one begins with her childhood experience in the middle of the Vietnam War and her journey into the city in order to make money to send to her family. These are parallel narratives. But instead of giving us the connection, instead of making it more linear, Fan does this amazing thing, which is the first 2 pages of this short story. Instead of giving this connection, she constructs a scene that merges 2 moments in one. And I've got it up on my next slide here. This is parts from that first scene, which is quite harrowing one, and it's an opening scene that does quite an amazing thing, because it sees a single event through 2 possible lenses, almost as if they're going on, almost as if there are 2 things going on at the same time. Notice that the language of the scene functions in 2 ways at once, right? One giving us a scene of birth, and the second one giving us a scene of rape. Lien was fighting them again, clawing at their arms, kicking her feet, pushing them away. Go get the boy. This one is strong. If you first start reading these sentences, you think it's a narration of a rape, right? You read on and you see that it's her giving birth, and the act of giving birth. But part of the kind of effect language of birth or language of rape.
Mark, I'm not sure what's going on with the sound. We'll just have to...
Yeah. So the missing scene that would actually tie together these 2 narrative strands is embedded in this first scene, right? We get both of them kind of merged into one. And the way in which I read this structure is it can't give us a story that just goes from beginning to middle, right? That would be impossible, because at each level there is the problem of how one gets to the other problem of just doing this as a straight kind of linear thing is that we would locate the violence of the rape only at one moment, and then everything else kind of happens after that. But what this structure gives us is violence happening at every point. Violence happening at the beginning, violence happening in the middle, violence happening at the end. And it's only in acknowledging this violence that we can start to recognize all the different subject positions that this occupies. As a girl, going to make money for her family, as a birth mother who has relinquished her child, as a woman who has experienced sexual violence,
this structure, which I think, again, and emphasize that enough, because this beginning scene is just amazing in terms of how it layers these two scenes right on top of each other. That violence is pervasive throughout the story. Let me give you another example of how we get this kind of not to be. I gave you one illustration of two kind of plot strands that don't move. Let me give you another example, and this is from the story We Should Never Meet. If you remember that story, the character Kim, who grew up in foster homes in the United States, she meets a sympathetic Vietnamese store owner who gives her a gift. She imagines that the store owner might be her husband. She's kind of imagining this, fantasizing it, perhaps desiring it. For example, the store owner seems to know something about Kim that she doesn't remember telling her. She knows Kim's birthday, even though Kim doesn't remember telling her. We can think about this as well as a plot trajectory in this story. Kim is also, as part of the story, asking about her biological mother. She goes to the social worker in order to try to find out more information in the hopes of gaining more information here. And this desire gets paralleled with this relationship with this older lady, the storekeeper, who would be, about the age of her mother. It's another parallel, but they never meet. They're two different people. They're two different historical personages. And while we see her desire, they literally cannot meet. And so when the lady does not respond in the way that Kim expects, Kim figures out, oh, well, maybe she misunderstood, the lady's action, or the store owner isn't having a filial feeling for him. Either way, each person cannot become who the other wants them to be. Because they're acting across this huge gap, this huge big gap between them that family is. And of course, this boils into some potential violence. Again, essentially tells man to go after him. The instance that I want to show you here is on page 51. My copy. Edition you have. But I want just to notice one thing in particular here. Kim never names the shopkeeper. Right? So she comes back, she was offended by and hurt by, hurt kind of emotionally and psychologically by this shopkeeper, not physically. And then comes home and he's like, what happened? Who hurt me? Bitch, that goddamn bitch. Who? And then keeps on asking who. Right? It's like, who is this person? You're not named. She didn't want me then and now, even now. What are you talking about? Kim remembers the first day they met when the woman caught her stealing. Thief, Kim said, she always thought that I was nothing more. And then keeps on asking, who? Who? Then was shaking her shoulders. She called him the thief. At the very end of this exchange, Kim still never tells Ben who this person is. All she says is meet common gifts, which is the name of the store. Right? So she gives Ben the name of the store, but the whole way in which this is constructed is really shrouded in mystery. It's uncertain in what ways Kim is referring to she. Right? Kim is ascribing some of her feelings for her biological mother, whom she's never met, onto the storekeeper, for sure. This line here is very telling. She didn't want me then and now, even now. Right? Is she talking about the storekeeper? Is she talking about her biological mom? It could fit. The she could fit both of those positions. So characters begin to blur here. The shopkeeper becomes something more like a figure who can take on multiple kinds of identities, so much so that it becomes difficult to refer to at all. And if you go back to the sequence, look for it. It keeps on getting interrupted. It keeps on getting interrupted by past memories, by relationships to her foster father. It keeps on getting interrupted so that we can't get this story straight. It's in this sense that they can come to change. In terms of a little bit, but they can never, right? That her and the shopkeeper can never meet because there's a sense that each person is layered with these hidden histories
these hidden desires that have to be accomplished in order to be given their own place. How are we doing on time, Jerng?
12 minutes.
Okay. Let me just, and then we've got time for questions.
That's all. That's 12 minutes. We have to break.
Oh, I see. Okay. So let me just mention this last aspect and then wrap up. The last aspect is free and direct discourse, which is something that Fan uses a lot in this story, so definitely look out for it. Free and direct discourse is when you have a combination of a third-person recording with a first-person speech or thoughts. So it's a kind of narration that mixes and blurs third person. It's just one example, just to give it obviously the boldest line. Page 30, just go, Kim pushed open the glass door, dangling a chime from the king, signaling her arrival. That's third person, narrator recording that. The storekeeper didn't even turn to look. Again, third person is recording that. Kim let the door slip shut behind her, and third person recording that. And then perfect. Perfect is the example of free and direct discourse there. Where's that perfect coming from, right? Is that perfect Kim's thoughts? Is that perfect Kim's, is that the narrator kind of channeling Kim's thoughts? Or is it just the narrator completely? We have this blurring happen. Look out for that as you continue reading this story, because it goes back to this point about Fan wanting to kind of blur characters. Wanting to blur characters together in order to make it really difficult for us to be able to just either, one, make simple continuities between people, or to simply attach background or history onto one So I've concentrated my attention primarily on the first two stories of the collection, but you can see parallels with some of the things I talked about in the next two stories. If you remember, visitors, Lien is kicking this old man, yelling that you don't know anything about me. Again, this instance of not being able to meet, coming from two different histories that are kind of colliding. In a later story called Emancipation, one that will probably resonate with you guys, since all of us have had the experience of writing a college essay, a college entrance essay. She is telling the story she's telling her life story, and she's telling it as a college essay. And so she's playing up the kind of pity and loss that she felt in order to make it a better college essay. Of course, knowing that even as she's doing that, she is doing violence to her own story. She is constraining her own identity and trying to reduce this college essay for a admissions. That is something to look out for. That's the story called Emancipation. Okay. So you've got a lot of fun ahead of you as you continue reading the rest of these stories. What I've tried to open up for you is the way in which this collection gives us a couple different narrative strategies for dealing with this question of relationships among history and identity. Again, relationships that are especially tense because these identities being produced are premised on erasing and forgetting. Erasing and forgetting people. Erasing and forgetting the role of government in creating some of these institutions. So what counts as a life is already being put very, very difficult. What you want to do, you've got to revise the terms, and I think Fan's collection gives us some powerful ways to do so. Thank you.
It'll be
definitely should check out that exhibit. Really well done. And
Art, can you give us a little kind of overview of what's in it? That'd be a great idea.
Yeah, this is an interesting project. Came out of a project called Adoption History, and they really wanted to produce a kind of museum and exhibit against the.
Sorry, the battery's dying, that's all.
Yeah. Against the grain of most kinds of museums, because most museums are built on dead stuff, right? Built on memorializing what was dead. And they definitely wanted to avoid that kind of thing. They wanted to give credence to kind of live and continuing history that has its legacy and that has, and I think Being Fans is a good book for thinking about this, thinking about the really kind of wide reach and extensions of these histories. Operation Baby Lift was arguably just kind of one discrete event, but it has its kind of tentacles, legacies. It affected lots and lots of people through direct and indirect connections, and so they wanted to capture some of that. So they're trying to talk to me about how to structure the space so that it's not just this kind of consumption of a dead history, right, or something that's.
Hey, I'm Don, by the way. Hi, nice to meet you. In person. So, obviously with both the Korean War and the Vietnam War, the United States sort of took on this responsibility of sort of this special arrangement and relationship that facilitated a whole host of both refugee families, but also transnational adoptions that were sort of born out of the displacements and violences of those wars. How has that shaped, how have those phenomena occurred or not occurred, or occurred differently, I guess, in the context of the violences that we've been a part of in the Middle East in the last, say, 2.5 decades?
Yeah. So it's interesting. There's a really great book out now, Untitled Genealogies of Korean Adoption, that show the specificity of what was going on in both Korea and in Vietnam. Namely, that even before the kind of main even before the main sending of adopted children started happening, Christian organizations had already kind of teamed up with the military in creating orphanage places, even before the official, but even before the kind of official start of the Korean War. So they're putting into place preparations for taking in children, then also sending them, primarily through a lot of Cold War kind of language. Right? They were trying to look better, to be seen as benefactors, to create a kind of humanitarianism ethic that was built around those orphanages. And that happened for both Korea and Vietnam. And in the cases of the Middle East, you've got a very, very different discourse going around. You don't have that Cold War battle and trying to. You do have a different kind of PR campaign going on, but you don't have that same kind of Cold War benefactor kind of language going on, and you have different kinds of conditions on the ground that you just don't. You didn't have that infrastructure already in place. In both Korea and Vietnam, they had infrastructure in place for taking in, transporting children, even fire the stars. Does that answer your question, Don?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, sort of. I mean, I guess I'm wondering what's happening. Like right now, like you don't necessarily know the answer to this either, but like what's happening with all of the now parentless or parentless Syrian refugee children, for example?
Yeah, I don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
More questions?
I was just wondering if you found it valuable to try to get the exhibit folks to highlight gaps and discontinuities. Is that beyond an exhibit, or is that short story only?
Yeah, I think Dan hit on a kind of really nice form, right, in order to do that work well, in order to keep the gaps as gaps and not make it too frustrating of a process. And we talked about that with the museum folks, right? And how to, instead of walking through the exhibit in a kind of linear way, you know, how might you shape how people walk through so that you don't give this semblance of a seamless story, right? Because the seamless story, as I was trying to convey to you guys, the seamless story, the seamless story, the ability to just say, okay, here's the history, it maps onto these kids in this kind of one-to-one way, actually denies a lot of the stuff that's going on. For those of you who don't know, one of the planes in Operation Baby Boom crashed. Like 10 minutes after it took off, killing all the babies that were on board. And so, you know, the official histories of this often just produce another displacement. It's a lot harder in the form of museum, because it's premised around a certain expectation that, okay, I'm going to learn about Operation Baby Lift, take it, you know, take me through from beginning to end. And I want to come out of that experience with a clear sense of what
Thank you, Mark, very much.